Okay, good afternoon, everybody. We are 4 hours away from the Super Bowl, which I'm sure most of you are probably focusing on. And I will be soon, just because why not? Anyway, we are here today for our lecture 2 on a network, a city of networks, and wanted to try to go through a couple things here first. Talk a little bit kind of where we are. You guys have started to get immersed into this. And first thing I want to say is, so help me God, if this PowerPoint presentation tries to jump ahead, I will stop immediately, try to figure out why it's doing that, and then start it again. So apologize that for last time. So I think there's a couple things. One, right now, we're just sort of talking about in this sort of bigger scheme of things, city, and really understanding the past, because that's how we get to understanding the present, and then more importantly, trying to figure out what the future is. Because hopefully, as we're going through this, I think all of you will start to realize that a lot of things repeat themselves, a lot of patterns repeat themselves. And what will make you guys great landscape architects is if you are able to see that, to be reflective designers and to be able to see that. Because hopefully as we're going into some of these things, you will realize that that's what everybody else has been doing. They just happen to figure it out enough ahead of everybody else that they get to lead some of these movements. So we've talked about, in terms of the green morass, current rules and regulations that apply, trying to understand the interrelationship with all of those. I will be, I think you guys had some really interesting insights in that. And so I've pulled off of the assignment today. I don't want you guys to worry about updating that or moving it forward. I really want you to spend a little bit of time just reading the couple assignments that we've got for this one and then watching the 2 videos. And then I will have a little quiz for you guys to take, and that's the only assignment is. And obviously the quiz will be on the readings and the videos. So that's what we have with that. We started off then with our first module, or our first lecture for City of Networks, really trying to understand everything up until the 1970s. And today we're going to kind of talk about what happened after that. Except I made a really terrible, terrible omission. I cannot believe I did this. I forgot to talk about Ian McHarg as part of the 60s and the 70s. I am hoping that Anne has told you a little bit about Ian McHarg, but just in case, we're going to have a little bit of a conversation about him now, because one of your videos that you're going to be watching is one of Ian's, his first major video, and really the beginning of the environmental movement in so many ways. And it's such a classic, and it's such classic McHarg. I did go to Penn. I was at Penn when Ian was there. In the 70s, he had really sort of already made his claim to fame, but so much of what he was about was important. This is the cover of his book, the original cover, Design with Nature. And down in the lower corner, there's a couple things on there that I just want to just chat with about, because they're going to come up both in Ian's talk. They also come up in Ignacio Brunster's film as well. Ignacio, like myself, were both, Ian was mentors of ours. We were at Penn 2 years apart from each other. And Ignacio stayed on and was part of Wallace Roberts' McHargue and Todd, and has been there for 22 years. His video is very much about some forward-thinking approaches to design and sustainability. I think you'll find it enjoyable. But one of the things both of them talk about is what we want versus what we need. And I think a lot of what you're going to see in the lecture today is this transition of us really starting to understand better what is it that we need for us individually, for what is a community, and for what we need as a planet. And really that has not really coalesced until 2010 and beyond, from my perspective. The other one that is interesting was this idea of control versus trust. And it's something that Frank brought up in his overview, which really talked about that the idea of control is what really does affect a lot. Who has control? Who controls what? Certainly we saw that in terms of Robert Moses and his control and his determination of who he was controlling and how. And then this whole idea of trust. One of your readings is about inequality and trust and how we act as citizens. Trust is also something that I know in my discussions with Derek is something that Robert talks about in terms of being a citizen and being part of a civilization. We put a lot of trust into individuals, and what we do with that trust, whether we are the ones being trusted or we are the ones trusting, is very important. And then this last one is something that we're not going to get into today. We will get into this as we move into our hybrids, but it's the idea of systems versus empathy. And from my perspective, it is that next evolution of the morphology of cities, and it will be a foundation by which you'll be moving your project forward. So that's where we are. Okay, so McHargue. Couple of things on McHargue. And I love this kind of quote, as a polemicist, McHargue set his thinking in radical opposition to what he argued was the arrogant and destructive heritage of urban industrial modernity, a style he described as dominate and destroy, and certainly is sort of a motto for environmentalist movement in the 60s and 70s, and I think you'll see that as you watch his video. So a couple things about him. 1957, he became a faculty member at the University of Pennsylvania and launched a class called Man in the Environment. And just so you know, probably, I think, he is the most important, most influential, and greatest national figure that landscape architecture ever had. I'm sure Anne would disagree with that, would probably say Fragrant Law Olmsted, but I say it's Ian. In 1963, he founded the firm of Wallace and McHargue Associates, later called Wallace, McHargue, Roberts, and Todd, and really were known for its central role in the development of the American environmental and planning and urbanism movements. In 1969, he wrote his book, Design with Nature, and really the ideas about sustainability and regenerative design all display the influence of design with nature. And it is that beginning. And so it's important that if you've never seen the book or looked at it, try to take a look at it a little bit, because it is where all of that started. And that's really important, I think, for you guys to know. Multiply and Subdue the Earth is the movie that you're going to watch, and it's McHargue in rare form. If you've never had a chance, or if you ever didn't have a chance, you probably didn't, to ever hear or see McHargue, he's in it. It's his baby, and I think you will enjoy it a lot. And he still is and was a larger than life figure. So anyway, and I think one thing about Ian that I hope you guys will think about as you move forward in your professional careers, and when we were at Penn, and I was there in the 70s, Um, this was very much the attitude that we had as students there, and it was this idea of an advocate versus a client. Um, Ian's firm had clients, but Ian was first and foremost an advocate of the environment. And I'm showing you this image because it's my design studio project, or the analysis for what was Tinicum Marsh. And so this was in 1977. And I show it to you just because what I think is great about it is that in the early 70s, after Ian had formed his firm, a developer came to him and said, I've bought this marsh out by the airport in Philadelphia, and I'm going to make a mall out of it. And Ian took one look at that and said, really? And he said, yes, and we'd like to hire you to do the plans for us to turn this into a shopping mall. Well, Ian not only said no, but he sued him and took him to court, and Tinicum became the first urban wildlife refuge in the country. And it is now the proud and happy home to a nesting set of bald eagles. It's a major flyway for birds, and it's this idea that I hope as landscape architects that we come back to. We may have clients, but we have multiple clients, and our clients are the people who we care about as good citizens. It's about the environment, and then it may be about the people who are going to pay us. So that's my little anecdote for today. All right. So the 1970s, couple things that clearly were starting to happen. We left off the last time talking about Earth Day, the beginning of the environmental movement. There was also, clearly during the 60s, was when a lot of the civil rights were coming into bear. Johnson, a huge supporter of that, was trying to help with changes in laws and rules. And I think just as a summary, because I think this is important as we go forward, just as an example across the country, what was happening around this, we had 16 Black Panthers that were put on trial in New York City for plotting to bomb a public building. We had whites in Lamar, South Carolina, that were attacking bus loads of Negro children on their way to their newly integrated school. And in California, we had Cesar Chavez being sentenced to jail for organizing a lettuce boycott. So civil, social, racial, cultural unrest was very much alive, along with the environmental movement. So the 70s were fraught with, I'm sure you guys all realize, but we're just going to hit this kind of quickly, a lot of stuff going on. Native Americans were similar. In 1973, Marlon Brando declined his Oscar for The Godfather because of the issues going on with American Indian militants who had stormed the town of Wounded Knee, and their resulting imprisonment. At the same time, this also saw the end of the Vietnam War, which also was fraught with with its own huge level of issues in terms of American people and where our focus was and our conscious and thoughts. So 1975 is the end of the Vietnam War. This quote talks about that there was no question that the army that was coming out of that was largely demoralized and lacked discipline. The 70s were really tough. And the 70s were just really tough. They were good and they were bad. So what's this have to do with cities? Well, a couple things then we're starting to formulate that really didn't become apparent until the 80s. And Leon Krier is an important person. He is talked about a lot as an architect, but again, just as Ian was the grandfather of so many aspects for which he does not get credit for, Leon Krier, German-educated English-based urban theorist, is really responsible for some pretty amazing things. And so during this period, he's looking back at some of the tried and true classical philosophies as a response to modernism and the desire to move in and focus on the human scale. So we're starting to see that kind of thing coming into play. And in particular, he looked at neighborhood quarters in European cities that had been defined by artisans' industries and pedestrian-oriented transport infrastructure. And out of that came his definition that the neighborhoods need to be defined by the 10-minute or quarter-mile walk. Yes, this was not Calthorpe. This was not Platter-Zyberg or Andres Duany. It was Krier who really came up with this concept in his initial explorations. So with that comes probably our next biggest movement around new urbanism and the beginning then of a whole host of variations on sort of the new town and what it should look like, and a framework that talks about compact, efficient communities that are pedestrian friendly, that are built around architecture focused on environmental sustainability eventually. This is Seaside. I'm sure most of you know of Seaside. And a couple things about Seaside. I love this diagram of Seaside because it is very plainly in its architectural rendering and its typology or typography, excuse me, hearkening back to some people that we talked about with before. We talked about Ebenezer Howard in the Garden City. We talked about Frederick Law Olmsted and Riverside. And this is clearly, if you took those two typologies and merged them together, you'd get Seaside. And so it was very interesting that this sort of approach was occurring. Now, a couple things to keep in mind. Seaside was basically a single family home, wealthy community, but did really garner a lot of support and energies, and became a model for a lot of suburban development. And I think that's the one thing that is important here as we talk about Seaside, as we talk about Peter Calthorpe's book, The Pedestrian Pocket Book, that what we're really looking at, similar to Howard and Corbu and Wright, we're still looking at new development. We're looking at how do we do new development? How do we fix suburbia? So really, a lot of this is, car bad, people good, and, suburbia has to get away from cars. Suburbia, no cars. So what you don't see with a lot of these is these are not trying to fix infill projects. They are not trying to go into the inner city and fix, Co-op City or the Bronx or Detroit or Cleveland, and all of those inner cities, because of white flight and everything we talked about last time, are in these incredible periods of decline. Well, most of these guys aren't being paid to look at that because the growth is out in these suburban zones. So anyway, 1989, the Pedestrian Pocketbook was born. It was essentially faculty and students developing a series of student charrettes that were then published in this little book. And really, it was about the new American dream and how do we restore public life to the city. And, it's got its central core. It's got everything radiating out. We have tight residential components here on either side. It's great. I spent a lot of time with the book, and I think it's good. So where does it go from there? So I think one thing that's interesting is, so we've got the 80s and the 90s now that are taking this idea of the pedestrian pocket, the 10-minute walk. And I know you guys, oh, look at that, it did it. I think it did it because I did a bad thing. So hopefully it won't do it again. I think all of you know the 10-minute walk. It's been ingrained into our brains, quarter mile, and that's important. But it's something that started to happen during these 20 years is this idea of the neo-traditional neighborhood development, suburban-centric. It's very much a revisionist attitude, looking back at old towns and the quaintness of those. We see this then trying to maybe have more of a focus on transit-oriented development, because these original ones were still heavily auto-focused. They were trying to reduce trips, but there still were a lot of cars. And eventually, by 2010, we see a social awareness that says this is such a rude use of the term. Sorry for the typo here. We're going to really talk about communities again, and people, and transit-oriented communities. And these then really start to look at infill projects, as we get into 2000. So 1990s, Peter Calthorpe then comes out with sustainability-focused urban design philosophies that evolved into his book, The Next American Metropolis. So what we're really starting to see is how do we codify what we're talking about? And that was very important for Calthorpe, that he wanted to go past a theoretical framework. He wanted to create codified rules that could be adopted nationally, that could be adopted by towns, communities. And that's, I think, a really important aspect of what he was trying to do, was to say there needs to be a way that these get rolled into the Uniform Building Code, that these get rolled into zoning. They're not just an additive effect. So as part of that, then, the Congress for New Urbanism is created. Calthorpe is the president of that. Not much different than what we saw with Well Building and the Well Building Institute. Those founders become the head of them and really try to help move those forward. So just to kind of quickly touch base, I think most of you have spent time with TODs, but those basic founding principles: organize growth on a regional level to compact and transit supportive, place commercial, housing, jobs, parks, and civic uses within walking distance of transit stops, create pedestrian-friendly street networks that directly connect local destinations, provide a mix of housing types, densities, and costs, preserve sensitive habitat, riparian zones, and high-quality open space, and then make public spaces the focus of building orientation and neighborhood activity. So interestingly here, what we don't see yet is food. We haven't seen the awareness yet of food, nor are we seeing this net zero concept yet in terms of energy. We're seeing basically a morphology that is found, that's working with policy, it's working with rail, it's working with roads. So pretty soon this is going to start to change, and we're going to start to see energy, food systems. So that's going to start to be sort of that next evolution that we're going to start to see. So couple things then. The idea of transit-oriented design. What we really start to see as we move out of the 90s and into 2000 is this evolution from a societal convenience to an environmental solution. And then eventually from that, a social imperative. And that's that next one that we'll talk a little bit more about next time. But so the idea of convenience, a lot of what Platter-Zyberg and Dwani's work and Calthorpe's work was criticized for was that a lot of things didn't work. One, they really weren't transit dependent because there was no transit system in place. That takes time. So it's really tough to come up with this cool idea, but you don't have a network to support it yet. So what do you do about that? The next piece of this was, how do we really start to merge our environmental awareness with community and sense of community in place? And so I've kind of put together this little list of things. Clearly, green building starts to become, there is an awareness. So the U.S. Green Building Council merges with the new Congress for Urbanism. They start to work together, which is very interesting as those two things come together. So we're not going to really put that together yet, but I think as you work on your concept mapping, you're going to want to think about that. Agriculture. Urban agriculture really starts to come into play as we see both this idea of, we were talking about that in terms of our idea of want versus need. And as we look at urban areas, and we're looking at blight and the need to deal with blight and the need to deal with food deserts, as we start to see those two things becoming very important in terms of urban areas and urban systems, urban agriculture becomes, it's a solution. It's great. So that starts to fit into there. It also starts to feed off of social justice and equity and social equity within our communities. So we're starting to see the realization in the 90s that inner cities, how do we stop this downward spiral? We need to keep our cities. We need to fix them. This, of course, continues into 2000, but we start to see this coming up. We also then start to see this idea of energy and the issue around energy, the issue around the cost of oil. What does it mean to have a net zero community? So we're taking our infrastructure to a new level. We're not just dealing with roads and rail. Now we're dealing with energy. So now we're at a national level that we're really starting to think about it. And then really trying to take multimodal to kind of that next level in terms of what that might look like. Some of those things include bike sharing systems. What are our new ideas that we come up with? Uber. All of those types of solutions are in fact multimodal if you really start to think about them. And then more importantly, what we really start to see in 2000, and we see it more, later after 2000, I would say 8 or 9, sort of mid 2005 and on, is a return to the city in multiple different ways. So I think in summary, because I don't think we don't really, when we talk about morphologies, there are not a lot of great infill examples of how all these things have come together. We have a lot of great examples of isolated elements. We have great examples of green roofs in Cleveland. We have great examples of urban farming in Detroit. But we don't have a lot of examples of that holistic community engaged design in an infill project where all these things have come together. And I think there's a couple reasons why that hasn't happened yet, but I think we're sort of poised for it. And so your sort of end product in this class is going to be sort of a set of tenets and some concepts for that holistic approach. And it's grounded in a school as the focus, but it's very much going to be an ecological model that's really going to look at, all those things and how these rings support each other and how it's that sort of larger vision of community. Um, so why can this start to happen now? I think there's a couple things. One, I really do want you guys, there is a reference lecture or paper that's in the module for you to take a look at. It's just for reference. It's the history of the TOD. And I think the one thing that hopefully it has helped drive home here with this module is that history repeats itself. Oh my God, over and over and over again. And and another thing is, and I love this quote, that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. Because with each crisis, out of it comes something new. The Great Depression, World War II, out of that came one of the greatest periods of prosperity that this country ever knew. Now, a lot of bad things happened because of that, but that's after the fact when we sort of look back at what was the impact of that. When everybody was in it, they saw the value. So the crash of 2008 is a huge one. And out of that, because we're still sort of in it, although a lot of people don't realize it, but we most certainly are still being affected by that, have become new things. And some of the new things that have come out of that we'll sort of talk about down here. But our response to this, it was a wake-up call, and I think there was a greater awareness of what has value, a greater awareness of empathy, and what it means to be a country and a city, and how do we take care of each other and ourselves. And part of that opportunity is these guys. Millennials, for the most part, exhibit a greater degree of empathy for others than previous generations. Don't want to. I was going to dive deeper into all of this and the facts and figures, but I don't think we need to. Overall, the things that we know is that the one thing that Calthorpe didn't have, and Duane and Platter-Zyber didn't have, they had developers who were saying, ooh, this is a great idea from an economic standpoint. But they still were dealing with a demographic that wanted cars, needed cars, had families, were living and had gotten them forced into an environment where in order for their kids to compete and do things, they had to use a car. They couldn't get out of that. Now you have a whole new generation that says, you know, I'm not buying that. One, I'm going to have kids later. And two, I like being around my friends, and I like the convenience of an urban environment, and I'm interested in an urban environment. I'm interested in issues around environmental degradation. I am interested in saving energy. I am interested in socially trying to fix a lot of the racial issues that we seem plagued with in our society. So as soon as you have a huge population that says, you know, only 24% of us want cars, whether anyone likes it or not, things will change. So here is this incredible national shift that is being driven by a demographic that will allow all these things to ramp up with incredible speed. And that's pretty exciting. The other thing that's interesting is, and I will also put this article in there, it talks about this idea of urban metabolism. And of course, I can't read my notes on my urban metabolism because the stupid recording thing is right where I want to be. What urban metabolism talks about is that in urban areas, after something like a crisis, after everything's sort of falling apart, there is an innate ability for extraordinarily rapid sort of success rates to occur in those cities as the population gets larger. And with that comes greater innovation and wealth creation per person. New York City is the best example of that right now. It has exploded in ways that no one ever could have imagined happening. And we're starting to see it a little bit here in Philadelphia. So it becomes a really interesting idea that that is sort of in opposition to biology, that sort of says biological organizations get slower as they get bigger. Here, what we're observing is that these urban infrastructure areas actually are getting faster at accomplishing things as they grow. So there's this synergy around those two things that's just starting to happen at a faster rate. So it's interesting because part of that then is this idea of a systems approach versus empathy. And if you are growing faster and faster, then you have to become much more efficient and resilient in how you accommodate those things. The next one and the last one is this idea of technology and what technology affords us. What I didn't go into is sort of that last typology. Fujisawa in Japan is the best example. It is a built smart town. They actually have technologies where if you're walking down the street and you seem sad, it triggers something like music to come out of buildings that will make you feel happy again. It's really kind of scary, but I think we're going to sort of leave that as something that we might get into more as we get into the idea of hybrids, because I think technology is important. I am very much a supporter of this idea that we can reconnect, and some of you have heard this ad nauseum from me, that the virtual world can help us reconnect to the real world in ways that probably will never happen. And that's something that a lot of people poo-pooed, especially around children, this whole idea, oh, my kid spends too much time in front of the computer. He'll never, understand how to appreciate the real world. Nature deficit syndrome, Last Child in the Woods, Richard Louv, all that stuff. But I'm very much of the mindset that technology will actually help us save the world in a lot of ways. If it is through urban agriculture, if it is through net zero, if it is through the decentralization of our systems so that we don't get these behemoth networks that cause so many problems in the world. So anyway, those are, I think, 4 important components that I would like to leave you guys with. I do have one case study that some students had put together for me for a site planning class a couple years ago. And I think the thing that I like about it is the structure of it. And so I'd like you to, it is a suburban solution. So I don't want you to bemoan it because of that, but I really want you to look at it as something that got built and actually worked and was successful. And then 2, the structure around this is going to be, I think, a great way for you to think about our school. And we'll talk a little bit about, we're not going to do Diston, we're going to do Ludlow. And I'll talk a little bit about why we're doing Ludlow and not Diston, which are good reasons. I think you'll enjoy that. But I think what's nice about this is, so I think in conclusion, what we're sort of seeing, let's see if this will let me write in white. Pen color, white, oh yeah, it will, yay, is this. It's like, holy cow. So, environment plus people plus design. And I think that's really what we're trying to look at is, we're looking at, in terms of community engaged design, how those things come together. So this exercise looked at, the students said, okay, we're going to set a set of tenets, and those tenets are going to really drive what was for them eventually a project in the studio, or excuse me, in the class. But I think that what was fun, and so this can be something that you guys can start to, you will each have your own personal set of design tenets that will respond to people, place, to all the things that we have talked about, and really help you sort of balance those relationships between them. But for the purposes of this, these are what the students had come up with. They said that they wanted a space where musicians can play for free. That was important. 40% of the outdoor space had to be pedestrianized. Every street has to have a bike path, sidewalks, and crosswalks. No more than one liquor store per 6 blocks. I think you probably all know about that. I don't know if that's necessarily the case, but that's okay. The site should have at least 14% of breathe easy structures. And we'll go into a little bit of what that is. The site must have a community center. A resource center for job training must be present on the site. The site must have dog parks. The site must be a farmer's market or a community garden. At least 30 to 40% has to be affordable housing. The site must encourage public transportation through a pedestrian arterway. 40% of bike paths, 10 bike rack storage units per commercial block, 50% of all outdoor gathering spaces be light lit during the evening and early hours. They must have public bike shares, mixed use. There should be a youth learning center, the space for community and for public art to display on site, and an area where kids can play on their own agenda, free play. So it's just kind of interesting. It's sort of, and so when we look at our Ludlow school, we're going to have sort of there's a sphere of influence where the school is the center, but there's these other things that are going on around it. And so part of that is to say, these are the tenets that I see the school evolving to have. But these other things within this zone also need to occur for that school to be successful. So think about this idea of tenets and think about what these are. Now this has very much a heavy, this is the social tenets for this. You're also going to have some environmental tenets that are going to go with this. There are going to be ones for energy. There may be one for net zero. So you're going to have other ones as well. But I think what I loved about this, and I wanted you to show, is that most of you guys are really good at environment, and you're really good at energy, and you're really good at net zero. But this one, I don't see everybody talking about those that much. So that's why I presented that. So this case study is High Point, Seattle, is this little project that was, and that's just kind of sitting right in this little area. So it was just a new community design that was built on similar tenets to the ones we were just talking about. The first one was that 40% of the outdoor space had to be pedestrianized, that every street had to have a bike path, crosswalk, and sidewalks. So that became a really kind of important. This is a little sort of community center area that was designed, which, as you can see, is heavily pedestrian focused. I can't even figure out, I think the closest car is probably over here somewhere. Oops, I did that, sorry. So I think another piece of it that was good is that, so yes, you had trails, you had commons, you had pocket parks, you had a network of all these things, and there was a diversity of elements that were going on. So it really had a wonderful quality about it. This is kind of an interesting one, and it starts to deal with this idea of breathe easy structures and what that really means. Particularly, for instance, in Philadelphia, we have a lot of homeowners. 40% of the homeowners in Philadelphia um, live in old homes that they cannot afford to take care of. As a result, they have leaky roofs. They have mold like you would not believe. So they have huge asthma and health issues. Um, the types of materials that get used, you wouldn't believe the amount of formaldehyde that gets used in low quality materials. So this was very interesting. This really started to look at from like for instance, the well building attitude. You know, what am I really getting, and what is that like for my for the health of myself and my children. This one I loved because you just don't see this too often, and that's that the development had to have 35 to 40% affordable housing. Right now, there is a wait list of 150,000 people for affordable housing in Philadelphia. Philadelphia builds 15,000 homes per year. So at that rate, we got a long way to go. The bike share, social interaction. So I think this kind of speaks for itself. But I did really like the idea of a bike share station. Oops, sorry. I think one of the things that I appreciate about this is, and it's something that I know for Derek and Zach who have been here, bike share stations have a tendency to only be in our wealthier, more affluent areas in the city. They are never at a school site, which just boggles my mind. So I think the importance of bike share systems are really going to become critical more and more. I think what was really nice about this was the idea of, again, the importance of social interaction with a bike share system, the physical activity component, and its compatibility with the greater neighborhood, and that you really need a dense urban setting for that bike share system to occur. Again, the food thing, I know you guys have got that figured out. Farmers markets, community gardens. I think one of the things that we're going to definitely take a look at is beyond just the farmers market and the community garden. There is the cooking of food and how that starts to fit in. There is the selling of food and how that starts to fit in. So you know the whole system, the whole agricultural system. So that's, to me, that's really a piece that we'll look at in terms of how that starts to fit in. So again, very simple case study and important one to be able to take a look at. I'm going to pause this for 1 minute so I can add a slide that I can draw on, and I'll be right back. Okay, I'm back. Of course, I just realized that I already added one. Haha. So we will end then with what I find to be an interesting scenario. And I had the opportunity to hear a lecture from Charlie Ledbetter. Charlie Ledbetter is English, and he has a think tank. Next week, we'll be diving into this in a little bit greater detail. But to me, this idea in terms of urban morphology and where I want to see you guys moving with your project and this idea of community engaged design deals with these two systems. And what Charlie talks about is, and in particular he uses London as his example, is if you take this XY axis and you say at this end we have high empathy, and at this end low empathy, and then we have low system, and then we have high system up here, which I cut off, sorry about that. That the best of all systems are those communities that are up here that exist with high system, with a high system and high empathy. And so what we're really looking for is that perfect spot right in there. That's our sweet spot where you have the best of both of these items. You know, it's just right in there. And the thing that's interesting about this and his description around it is that we need highly efficient systems that can move people without people feeling like they're too congested and too, you know, it has to be an efficient system. Energy has to work. Food systems have to work. If our systems are highly evolved and are efficient, and then as people, if we have a high degree of empathy towards each other, then our public spaces become these wonderful places. And they're wonderful places because we truly enjoy the people that we are around and with. And it's not just because they're like us, it's because we are all enjoying a space together. And that the diversity of people in that place is enjoyable. And it's enjoyable because it's easy to get to, and it's clean, and there's food, and there's economic well-being for everybody. So I think what's interesting with this as an approach, and what I like about it is it doesn't try to say, well, is it about people or is it about the environment? You know, what is it about? And this really starts to try to say, well, it's about all those things, you know, and that's what really becomes important. It's not, so we're really sort of moving it to a new level. And of course, people are in there, and the environment's in there, and economics is in there, and race, and culture, and everything else. But it allows us to not silo these things the way we have been. So that is something that we'll talk a little bit more as we get into the hybrid nature of what we're trying to do. The other thing I noticed just in closing, we're going to wrap it up here at just about an hour, is that we didn't really, everyone did a pretty good job focusing in on those larger systems, but we really didn't drill down into the school aspects of those. So we'll do that more as we get into this idea of hybrids. And when we start to talk about hybrids, we're really going to be sort of talking about some specifics. And those specifics for this class will be Philadelphia. It will be the site. And we'll just talk a little bit about Ludlow School right now. Ludlow School. And then it'll be about our systems that relate to this site and to Philadelphia. And it'll be about children and education and schools. If we think about that, there's a couple things I'll just show you. So if we're going to do a little diagram here for our Ludlow School. So Ludlow School is within Old Kensington neighborhood. It sits right here. Here's some cross streets. It sits next to here, a park. There's a community center. It sits next to here, I guess it's 12. It's a 10 to 12 story abandoned umbrella factory. And it's not just any abandoned building. It's actually one of the top 10 abandoned buildings in the city in terms of being the most beautiful abandoned buildings. And that's when you know you have blight, when you actually do a top 10 for your blighted and abandoned buildings. And it's in the top 10. I can't remember which it is, but it's a pretty spectacular building. The site itself is pretty abysmal. It is a historic building, so it's great that way. It is a K-8 building. It sits among a whole collection of these are townhomes and empty lots and vacant buildings. So it is in an old part of the city that industrial part of the city. I live right over here. So it's, or I have an apartment here. And it has one other thing that's really interesting, and it has that right here, which I am part of. This is the Finquita Urban Farm. Now, interestingly enough, we got all these things here, but there's no connectivity between any of these things. There's a new 5-star restaurant that sits right here. It buys all its food from these guys whenever it can, which is pretty cool. But the connection between that and this and whatever this is going to be, because it will change at some point, just give us this great space with this wonderful, and this is Masters Street. So if we go over here, do another little diagram just to give you guys a little, oh no, oh no, oh no. Okay, sorry about that. So we're going to go back. So just a real quick one, because I know some of you may want to explore this, knowing what I know about you guys. So just as sort of a further, we have Gerard Street, and then we have 5th Street. We have a trolley car. It's terrible, isn't it? Car. A trolley car is here. School sits right there. So we have a great, in terms of this idea of connectivity, in terms of mass transit. We have buses also. We have some great other components that yeah, I think all kind of fit together. So this is why I really like the school, and I think will be great for our next, for our potential site. So there's a recap in terms of where we are. Just make sure you go to, oh my God, it only started to happen till the end. Sorry about that. Okay, so just a recap in terms of where we are with the class. So we've got Module 2, which we're wrapping up. Go to that folder on Canvas, and everything that you need is in there. There'll be a quiz that I will post on. It's funny, it was working so much better before. I don't know why. I'll post that Wednesday. And then we're going to move into our next module. So I just want to kind of recap on sort of kind of where we are with this stuff. And so we'll be moving into defining hybrids. Will be our module number 3. We'll be starting to really start to explore more about Philadelphia. So as I mentioned, we'll be looking at Philly, the school, and the neighborhood. We'll end on the 26th with that. Then we'll go into a 3-week period before we end with spring break, where you'll start to think about your integration strategies. So, and I'm not even going to try to do that because that just looks like shit. So I'm not going to, I don't know why it's doing that. So anyway, we'll be looking at that. And then after spring break, we'll be using March. We're using the end of March, actually the April, to be able to put together a refinement of those. So that's where we are. Thanks. Don't forget, read your 2 articles, watch the 2 videos. Ignacio is just an incredibly talented and wonderful person. I saw his lecture in person, and I think you'll enjoy it. Ian is a great character, and we will not do won't do a Zoom this week, and I will talk to you guys later. Thanks.